Hello, everybody. So, this week, the Pentagon released a report that contained some highly relevant information given what's been going on in the news lately, namely having to do with Syria. So, the Trump administration seemingly is all over the map on the Syria situation. Last week, Trump supposedly instructed the military to begin preparing for a withdrawal from Syria of U.S. troops. Now, there was never any debate to begin with about whether to send U.S. troops to Syria, but now the debate rages over whether to remove them. That's sort of a separate question. And then over the weekend, there was this alleged chemical attack carried out by the Assad government, which led to an indeterminate number of deaths, and that naturally ratcheted up the chorus of the usual suspects calling for a larger scale intervention in Syria to depose Assad or punish him in some fashion, what have you. Now, this is sort of what the discussion is going on at the public relations level or at the surface level, but below the surface, there are some developments which probably give more insight or better insight into what the U.S. government is actually doing with regard to Syria. So the Pentagon released a report this week, which is a census report that it releases on a quarterly basis. The census report actually compiles data with respect to the activities of contractors, U.S. contractors contracted by the Defense Department to provide all kinds of supplementary services to the U.S. military. This report basically takes a census of those individuals that operate under the jurisdiction of the U.S. CENTCOM, which is the main organizational entity which carries out military operations in Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, elsewhere. So in prior quarters, this Pentagon report didn't take survey of contractors in Syria. There was no mention of contractors located in Syria in prior reports going back to the initiation of Operation Inherent Resolve in 2014. That was when the U.S. first started to begin to bomb Syrian targets or targets within the borders of Syria. But since then, there's been no official indication, at least as per these reports, that there has been a U.S. contractor presence in Syria. Now, in the past, the Defense Department has disclosed that it has provisioned contracts to various companies to provide services in Syria, mostly, quote, intelligence gathering services. But whatever services those contractors were providing hadn't ended up as a record in one of these Pentagon reports. Well, that changed as of this week. So as of this week, the Pentagon now does formally acknowledge in its census data gathering protocols the presence of U.S. contractors in Syria. Now, what is a complication here is that the Pentagon clusters together Iraq and Syria as a category for which it gathers data. So there's no differentiation made between contractors working in Syria versus Iraq, and it's impossible, at least with the data that's been presented, to sort those out by country. But compared to the previous census report from January of this year, there was a substantial uptick in overall contractor activity, which somebody could reasonably infer from that this means that contractors in Syria are engaged in activities such as base support and construction. Those are two categories of activity that the Pentagon cites as something that U.S. contractors are engaged in. So there was a substantial uptick in contractors in Iraq and Syria engaged in base support and construction, which suggests that if the contractors are engaged in base support and construction, they are laying the groundwork for a more permanent presence in Syria, notwithstanding any official declarations by the president or by members of the administration. If you're preparing to support the construction of bases, then you're preparing for a long-term presence in the country in question, which is Syria. And this kind of thing doesn't make huge headlines, but it is reflective of what is actually going on the ground level that is distinct from whatever public proclamations are coming out of the highest levels of government. Now, recall back before Rex Tillerson was fired as Secretary of State, he made a statement in January saying that the U.S. was essentially bringing about a long-term perpetual presence in Syria. And there weren't a huge amount of specifics as to what that would entail. But if U.S. contractors now are being officially tallied by the Pentagon data gathering operation for their activities in Syria, it's a good bet that this means that there's a long-term presence in the making, and that any, quote, withdrawal probably would not encompass a withdrawal of these individuals who, ultimately are able to derive a profit from U.S. government funding and have a economic incentive to remain there as long as possible. So that is something to be mindful of, and we will continue covering it. The link to the story will be in the description box as usual, and you can see all the relevant charts and graphs and that good stuff. So have a wonderful day.